sock was also popular in the 70s, not as a prison, but as a pet.
Happy, happy Munchie.
I love you, Munchie.
Remember those weird, wonderful fads that made no sense, but somehow made your whole week? In the 1970s America, these wild trends popped up fast and loud, giving us something to laugh about, wear proudly, or pass around at school. Funny how the silliest things stuck with us the longest, isn't it? There was a time in the 1970s when streaking wasn't just a dare, it was practically a movement. People, usually men, decided that the best way to make a statement at public events was to run buck naked across a field, a court, or a university quad. And the weirder part? Everyone kind of expected it. You were not watching a football game unless somebody's cousin or calculus professor made a run for it mid-play. Security chased. People cheered. News anchors actually had to keep a straight face as they reported it. Somehow, streaker tackled near the end zone became a real sentence on the nightly news. Some streakers wore masks. Some wore socks. Some wore nothing at all but a grin and a plan. It hit its peak when someone streaked the Academy Awards and flashed the peace sign behind David Niven. You heard that right, the Oscars. Streaking was not about politics or protest. It was about chaos. It was about being the weirdest kind of folk hero for 10 seconds before the cops showed up. Nobody's sure why it started. Nobody really remembers how it stopped. But for a few bizarre years, if you saw a big crowd and someone getting tackled with no pants on, it was just another Thursday. Mood wall posters in the 1970s were the emotional support animals of teenage bedrooms. You were not a real teenager unless your wall screamed something deep like, "Hang in there," with a cat barely clinging to a rope. Sunsets, unicorns, space scenes with glowing planets. These posters were basically printed therapy sessions with glitter. Some had waterfalls and phrases like, "Today is the first day of the rest of your life," as if that was going to help you survive algebra. They were mass-produced, cheaply laminated, and sold in bins next to lava lamps and incense. You could find them rolled up at the back of a Spencer's Gifts or proudly hung above a beanbag chair. The messages were always vague but intense. You were 13 years old, had not paid a bill in your life, but you needed a poster to remind you to keep on truckin'. And somehow, you did. These posters were both soothing and confusing. Was the crying dolphin supposed to symbolize your soul? Probably not. But it felt like it. Everyone had one, or 5. You hung them with thumbtacks, maybe framed them if you were fancy. They faded in the sun but never lost their drama. It was visual self-help before self-help became a genre. Waterbeds were supposed to be the future of sleep, and maybe they were, if you liked sleeping in a tidal wave. The pitch was seductive. A mattress filled with water that would contour perfectly to your body, like floating on a cloud made of dreams. The reality? Slosh, sway, backache, leak. You got in and the bed kept moving. You rolled over, and so did the other person, usually at you or off the side. Every waterbed had that soft vinyl smell, like a pool toy got promoted. They were impossible to move, nearly impossible to fill, and entirely possible to explode. Some came with heaters because cold water plus pajamas equals instant regret. But if you were a couple in the 1970s, chances are you owned one, and you defended it like it was a third member of the relationship. It was not just a bed. It was a vibe. That slow roll when you sat down, the bloop of the waves shifting under your blanket. People thought it was sexy. And maybe it was, until 3 a.m. when the seam popped and your bedroom turned into a shallow pond. Puka shell necklaces were your ticket to island cool, even if the closest beach was a kiddie pool in the backyard. These little white shell fragments were strung together and worn by teens across the country like they just got back from a week of surfing in Oahu. Never mind they lived in Ohio. The puka shell did not care. You could have never seen the ocean and still pull off the look. They felt exotic, even though they were sold 3 feet from the Orange Julius stand. You wore one to the skating rink and felt like a cast member from Hawaii Five-0. Even gym teachers wore them on field day, paired with socks and sandals. They snapped easily, but no one cared. You just bought another. For about 6 months, puka shells had more social currency than your GPA. In fact, most people never saw the ocean. They just saw the necklace on a friend of a cousin who said it helped his vibes. Boys wore them with open shirts and sun-bleached hair. Girls wore them stacked with friendship beads. Either way, if you had one on, you were chill. At least in theory. They were sold everywhere. Surf shops, head shops, mall kiosks. They went with flared jeans, platform sandals, and every kind of tan, fake or real. The puka shell said, "I am easygoing, but I could win a beach volleyball tournament if needed." For a minute there, these necklaces were a fashion must-have, even if the shells dug into your collarbone every time you bent forward. Totally worth it. CB radio slang was the one language everybody wanted to speak, even if they never got on a highway. Citizens band radios made trucker culture a full-blown fad. You did not need a big rig, you just needed a handle. Everyone had one. Kids made their own call signs using crayons and notebook paper. Someone in every town claimed their dad talked to real truckers on Channel 19. Even Grandma had a handle, and she used it while baking banana bread. People practiced their trucker drawl like it was a second language. If you did not say 10-4 before hanging up the phone, were you even trying? Snow Bunny, Thunderfoot, Grandma Goose. It was like AOL screen names before AOL existed. You said things like 10-4 good buddy and breaker 19 to your friends, your mom, or into the mirror if you had no one else to talk to. Kids begged for walkie-talkies just to pretend. CB radios were everywhere, in cars, garages, and basements where Dad said things like, "Copy that," before going to the kitchen. It felt like joining a secret club made of truckers, pranksters, and your neighbor down the block. The best part? You actually learned the lingo. Bear in the air meant police helicopter. Chicken coop was a way station. 18 wheels and a reefer. Well, look it up. For a few years, America talked like one giant convoy. Farah Fawcett's feathered hair was not just a style. It was a commitment. Everyone wanted that soft, perfectly sprayed cascade of waves flipping away from the face. And everyone tried. You teased, you curled, you basically turned your bathroom into a low-grade chemical testing site. The hairspray cloud was so thick you could lose a sibling in it. Combs broke, mirrors fogged. You kept going. You were not just styling, you were sculpting. At least one person got grounded for using Dad's entire can of mousse. You sprayed until the room fogged. The goal was volume. The result was often chaos. If your bangs drooped, you failed. If you could pass a comb straight through it, you failed harder. Girls stood in bathrooms with 3 mirrors and a can of Aquanet, silently praying to the gods of glamour. Even some boys gave it a shot. Farah's poster in the red swimsuit made her the decade's most iconic beauty, but it was the hair that had everyone panicking before school. Your friend got it right once, and she became a legend for 2 whole weeks. Feathered hair was a rite of passage, a symbol of cool and a literal fire hazard near candles. And we still talk about it. Because Farah did not just flip her hair, she flipped the whole nation with it. The hustle was not just a dance, it was a phenomenon. If you went to a wedding, a prom, a block party, or a roller rink in the 1970s, somebody was doing the hustle. You pointed, you spun, you clapped. You did not need rhythm, just a basic understanding of the phrase, "left foot now." People turned their living rooms into practice floors with furniture pushed to the walls. Even your grandpa tried it once and threw his back out. Nobody knew why it worked, but everyone agreed it did. And if you heard the opening notes of the song in public, you physically had to do it. Everyone danced like they were in a training montage for synchronized disco. Line dancing became stylish. Saturday nights meant polyester, sweat, and steps you rehearsed in the mirror all week. The song literally told you how to do it. Do the hustle. And we listened. It was part disco, part conga line, and part martial arts demo depending on who was leading. Grandmas learned it. Uncles showed it off in the living room. It did not matter if you had rhythm. What mattered was that you committed. The hustle was joy with shoulder pads and bell bottoms. And when the music stopped, you were winded, smiling, and somehow craving punch. Novelty. Ice cubes with bugs inside were the peak of 1970s practical jokes. You dropped one in your uncle's drink and waited. The plastic spider slowly bobbed to the surface, and so did a scream. These things were sold as hilarious gag items, but mostly just made people paranoid every time they saw a glass of soda. The bugs always looked wet, which made it 10 times worse. They floated in just the right way to catch your eye after your first sip. Siblings used them for psychological warfare all summer long. Some kids froze actual plastic roaches into homemade cubes for maximum terror. No one ever trusted fruit punch again, and that was part of the fun. They came in kits with rubber vomit and fake dog poop. Some had fake flies, others had spiders so realistic they made your aunt throw her drink across the room. That was the whole point. You were not trying to be classy. You were trying to be funny. Even if it meant cleaning up Sprite off the shag carpet. Every novelty shop sold them. Some vending machines had them right next to candy. Parents pretended to be annoyed, but they laughed too. It was the 1970s. If your cousin didn't try to poison your fruit punch with a fake roach, were you even really at a family barbecue? The Bionic Woman lunchbox was a cafeteria trophy. Kids slammed them on the table like it was a badge of honor. It had the show's logo, her face in mid-action, and maybe a matching thermos that leaked if you looked at it wrong. But still, iconic. Every kid wanted one. The Bionic Woman could outrun cars, crush bad guys, and still look cooler than anything else on television. She was fast, fierce, and fully lunchbox worthy. You packed it with sandwiches, carrot sticks, and cookies, all sealed under her superpowered likeness. She was not just a character, she was part of your lunch. And if you had that matching thermos with the red plastic lid, you were elite. The lunchbox aisle at the store was like the toy aisle for coolness. No superhero, not even Spider-Man, had the grip on elementary school fashion that the Bionic Woman did. Biorhythm charts were like astrology's math-loving cousin. You plotted your emotional, intellectual, and physical highs and lows across a wavy graph that looked like a lie detector. People kept track like it mattered. I cannot take the test today. My chart says I am at a mental low. That was a real excuse. It showed up in magazines, lunchroom conversations, and even some office break rooms. You just needed your birth date and a little time with a pencil. The results looked scientific. The meaning? Questionable. But the belief was real. Some couples blamed biorhythm clashes for breakups. Athletes checked their peaks before big games. It was part science fiction, part calendar, and part mood ring in paper form. People swore by it, until they did not. But while it lasted, you tracked your chart like it could tell your future. Pantsuits in the 1970s were the answer to every occasion. Church? Pantsuit. Job interview? Pantsuit. Backyard barbecue with Aunt Marlene and 3 uninvited neighbors? Pantsuit. It was the era of women dressing for power and comfort at the same time, in matching jacket and slacks, all made of polyester that could stop a bullet and hold a wrinkle for decades. The fabric was always a little too shiny, the colors were bold enough to blind someone across the room, and the lapels, huge. You could land a small plane on them. Buttons were oversized, shoulder pads mandatory, and sometimes they had pockets, but not enough to hold anything except a peppermint and a tissue. These suits came in every hue: avocado green, rust orange, baby blue. It was like someone melted a crayon box onto a sewing machine. But you wore it with pride. Women strode into offices, classrooms, and PTA meetings looking like they meant business and maybe disco after. Some even wore turtlenecks underneath, because nothing says I am ready for my moment like a snug polyester turtleneck under a double-breasted blazer in egg yolk yellow. They were hot, literally. But style meant sacrifice. People thought these suits were the height of fashion. And maybe they were, until you tried to sit down and realized you were now permanently bonded to a plastic chair. Fuzzy steering wheel covers were part decoration, part thermal hazard. If you wanted your car to look groovy and feel like a teddy bear's paw at 10 and 2, this was your moment. They came in neon pink, electric blue, lava lamp swirl, leopard print, or shag so long it looked like your steering wheel had hair. Putting one on was like fitting a pair of bell-bottoms around a bagel. They never went on smoothly, and when they did, your horn was never quite the same again. In summer, they turned your hands into oven mitts. In winter, they froze and turned into woolly rings of regret. Still, you loved it, because nothing said cool ride quite like gripping a puffball of questionable material that shed like a nervous dog. The matching trend was fuzzy dice on the rearview mirror, maybe a bead curtain in the back window. And if you were really living the dream, you had fuzzy seat covers too. All of it baking in the sun while you told your friends how sweet your ride was. These things never lasted long. They unraveled. They stank after a while. But that was fine. By the time they were falling apart, you had probably moved on to bumper stickers and air fresheners shaped like peace signs anyway. The invisible dog leash was pure 1970s comedy gold. It was a stiff wire shaped like an arch connected to an empty collar. That was it. That was the entire gimmick. You walked down the sidewalk holding this thing like it was an actual leash, and everyone else had to just play along as your dog trotted by doing absolutely nothing. Kids loved it. Grown-ups fell for it. You were 10 years old, dragging air on a stick, and people pointed, laughed, and sometimes even asked the name. The invisible dog leash made it all the way from gag stores to county fairs and family cookouts. Some kids added sound effects. Others faked poop scoops for dramatic flair. There was a whole generation of parents who bought this nonsense just so their kids could confuse strangers in parking lots. You knew the joke would land because the leash bounced like something was pulling against it. The wire even had that springy tension to it. It looked almost believable from 20 feet away. But even when the jig was up, the laughter still came. It was the cheapest kind of prop comedy, and it worked every time. You were not walking a dog. You were walking a moment. Earth shoes were not designed for comfort. They were designed for alignment. With negative heel technology, they sloped downward from toe to heel, as if you were constantly about to hike up a hill in reverse. The marketing claimed they were good for posture, digestion, and probably world peace. You slipped them on and suddenly walked like you had just discovered gravity. They were ugly. Let's get that out of the way. Clunky, heavy, and beige. The kind of shoe that made your feet look like garden bricks. And yet, people wore them everywhere. Health nuts, hippies, suburban dads with philosophical reading habits. You saw them in co-ops, on hiking trails, and under wide-legged jeans in the school pickup line. Earth shoes felt like you were doing something, like you were sticking it to the system one awkward stride at a time. They were the Crocs of their day, mocked and beloved in equal measure. People said things like, "Once you get used to them," which was code for, "I cannot feel my toes, but I refuse to give up." They disappeared eventually, but not before leaving an entire population with very strange tan lines and confusing memories of trying to look enlightened while shuffling like a duck. The Gong Show was weird, wild, and wonderful. And so were the Halloween costumes it inspired. If you do not remember, it was a talent show where being bad was half the point. Contestants performed bizarre acts until a panel of judges literally banged a gong to cut them off. Naturally, people took inspiration from this chaos and turned it into October brilliance. Rubber chickens? Yes. Cheap wigs? Absolutely. Costumes made entirely of aluminum foil and glitter? You bet. The best Gong Show costumes were DIY masterpieces that barely made sense but somehow worked. One year you were a human kazoo. The next, you wore 20 sunglasses and called yourself Disco Eyeball. There was no rule book, just cardboard, tape, and questionable judgment. You saw these at school parades, office parties, and costume contests where the prize was a bag of candy and eternal respect. Kids got in on it too, even if they did not understand the show. Parents laughed, teachers winced. The whole thing felt like performance art without the tuition. It was silly, it was surreal, and it was the most fun Halloween had in a long time. Bathtub stickers in the 1970s were a cheerful defense mechanism. They were shaped like flowers, fish, turtles, or rainbows, and their sole job was to keep you from falling flat on your back during your Saturday night scrub. Every house had them. They started as a safety feature and quickly became decor. You would step into the tub and be greeted by 6 pastel daisies and a confused starfish. The adhesive wore down over time, but that did not stop anyone. You just hoped the sticker that peeled off last week was not the one saving you from slipping today. And if you did fall, you landed on a smiling cartoon octopus. So at least there was that. These stickers stuck to every surface, whether or not they should. Some ended up on tile walls, sink basins, or even refrigerator doors. Why? Because they were fun. It was the 70s. If it came in a flower shape and stuck to something, you used it. Parents told kids to watch out for the bluefish, as if that sticker had any real traction left. But we believed it. Because bathtub stickers were not just anti-slip pads, they were your underwater squad. Shiny nylon short shorts for men were not a suggestion. They were an epidemic. You saw them everywhere: backyards, gyms, 4th of July barbecues. They were so short they could pass as a belt if the wind blew. Usually bright red or electric blue, always tight. No one wore them casually. They were a choice. You had to commit. They squeaked when you walked, rode up when you sat down, and reflected the sun like a signal flare. Some had stripes on the sides. Others had waistbands that went up to the ribcage. Dads wore them with tube socks and tank tops that said things like Grill King. Uncles mowed the lawn in them. Coaches barked orders in them while their thighs lit up like warning lights. You could see a tan line and a regret line at the same time. And yet, somehow, they became iconic. People look back and laugh, but deep down, they remember how cool they thought they looked. The 1970s were fearless, and no fabric feared exposure less than shiny nylon. Glow-in-the-dark everything was a marketing miracle. If it lit up after bedtime, it sold. Stars for your ceiling, shoelaces that pulsed like alien spaghetti, even underwear. Yes, underwear. With glow trim. It all glowed, and kids needed it. You were not a real 1970s kid if your room did not sparkle green at midnight. Ceiling stars were the big one. You stuck them up with tape or glue dots, made your own constellations, and stared at them until you fell asleep. They barely stayed on. Half would fall in the middle of the night and hit you in the face, but you kept adding more. There were stickers, keychains, even cereal box toys that promised to light up your whole universe. And sometimes they did. For about 20 seconds after the lights went out, you charged them under the lamp, turned off the switch, and waited for the magic. It was short-lived. It was dim. But for those few seconds, your boring bedroom turned into a galaxy. The Shaggy dog look for boys was less about fashion and more about survival. Boys in the 1970s let their hair grow long, wavy, and wild, usually past the ears, often over the eyes. You could not see a chalkboard, but hey, you looked cool. Hairbrushes were optional. Combs? Lost in the mess. Moms yelled. Teachers gave up. Your forehead became a memory. And if you rode a bike, you were basically navigating traffic blindfolded. Some kids flipped it out at the bottom, trying to match their favorite rock star. Others let it hang heavy and mysterious. Everyone swore they were going to grow it out just a little more. But that little more turned into summer break with hair like a sheepdog. Photos from this era are mostly kids squinting through bangs, smiling with heads tilted like their hair weighed 40 pounds. Eventually, someone caved and got a bowl cut. But until then, the Shaggy look ruled. Plastic wallet chains for kids were the ultimate fake rebellion. They clipped onto your belt loop and hung down with pride, even though your wallet held $2, a Chuck E. Cheese token, and a punch card for frozen yogurt. Still, you felt dangerous, like you might buy gum and a comic book. These chains were bright, chunky, and impossible to ignore. Neon green, safety orange. Some had glitter inside the links. You walked into school like a junior biker gang member who also liked stickers and cartoons. Parents rolled their eyes. Teachers confiscated them when they started whipping around. But you clipped it back on the next day like a badge of coolness. You were edgy, you were loud, and you still asked for lunch money. Kissing balls were what happened when mistletoe went corporate. These were not dainty little sprigs tied with ribbon. These were full-blown holiday orbs, often the size of a bowling ball and covered in plastic holly, fake snow, and glitter so aggressive it stayed on your sweater until March. You hung one in the doorway and suddenly it was an event. Guests walked in and paused under it like it was a toll booth for smooches. Grandma kissed the dog. Your uncle kissed the neighbor. Someone always made a joke about getting caught. It was awkward. It was festive. It was tradition. The kissing ball was not optional. If your house had a front door, it had one of these puffed-up pomanders dangling from a hook. Some had little bells, others lit up, some looked like a pine cone exploded in a craft store. But they worked. People leaned in. People laughed. Couples used it as an excuse. Teenagers avoided it like it was radioactive. You could not walk under one without someone calling you out. "Oh, look who's under the kissing ball." And then the panic set in. You could not move. You could not escape. You just had to accept your fate. All season long, it hung there, a decorative threat and a glitter bomb rolled into one. And every year, without fail, it came back out of the attic with half the leaves missing, tangled in tinsel, and still somehow magical. Fake mustaches from Gumball machines were the height of low-effort disguise. You slid in a quarter, twisted the knob, and out popped a tiny plastic capsule holding your ticket to instant maturity, or instant comedy. Inside was a fuzzy little crescent with a strip of sad adhesive that barely clung to your lip. You stuck it on, took one breath, and watched it fall into your soda. But for those brief 3 minutes when it did stay, you were transformed. A movie villain, a lounge singer, a very confused cowboy. Kids wore them to school and tried to keep a straight face. Adults pretended not to notice. Everyone laughed, mostly because no one could talk properly with one on. The edges curled, the fuzz shed. It tickled your nose and gave you hives if you left it on too long. But still, you wanted another one. There was something magical about popping open a capsule and discovering whether you got the thick handlebar or the weird pencil-lined stash. You showed it off. You posed in the mirror. You said things like, "Indeed," and "I say," and "This town ain't big enough," even though your voice cracked halfway through. Some kids collected them. Others traded them like Pokemon long before Pokemon was a thing. And when you got the rare giant mustache that covered half your face, that was jackpot. For a minute, you felt grown up, or at least funny enough to crash your parents' dinner party. Velvet Elvis paintings were peak 1970s wall art. And no, we are not joking. They were sold at gas stations, swap meets, flea markets, and truck stops. If you had an empty spot on the wall, there was a velvet Elvis waiting to fill it. These things were dramatic. Thick black backgrounds, neon blue suits, piercing white eyes that followed you around the room, like the Mona Lisa if she headlined in Las Vegas. They glowed under black light. They felt soft, like your grandma's couch, and they screamed style in the loudest, most rhinestone-covered way possible. Most were painted somewhere in Mexico and sold along the highway rolled up in tubes. And when you finally got one, you hung it in the den, the garage, the rec room. It did not matter. It belonged. Sometimes Elvis was singing. Sometimes he was just brooding into the velvet void. Either way, he looked cooler than anyone you knew. People judged you for owning one. But secretly, they wished they had one too. It was the perfect blend of kitsch and cool. The king of rock and roll immortalized in flocked textile. Families passed them down like heirlooms. Friends argued over who had the good one, the one with the red guitar or the Vegas cape. They faded over time, but never lost their power. In a world of wood paneling and lava lamps, the Velvet Elvis reigned supreme. DIY t-shirt iron-ons were how you told the world exactly who you were, or at least who you thought you were that week. You went to the store, picked out a design from a wall of options. Garfield, Snoopy, a peace sign, or a cartoon frog saying, "Keep on truckin'." Then you bought the blank shirt and took it all home with a dream. Heat up the iron. No steam. Apply even pressure. Wait. Peel slowly. Pray. And then, the reveal. Sometimes it came out perfect. Sometimes it was backwards. Often it was off-center. But that was fine. That was yours. You wore that wrinkled masterpiece with pride, even if the frog's eye was halfway down your armpit. The image started to crack after one wash. The edges peeled after two. But you kept wearing it anyway because it was custom. You made it. And nobody else had that exact misaligned cartoon raccoon saying "right on." Kids did them at birthday parties. Teens did them for school spirit. Parents did them for family reunions where everyone had a matching, fading Smith Bash 1978 shirt that disintegrated by autumn. They were cheap, they were messy, and they were perfect. You wore your weird little personality on your chest, crooked, melting, and glorious. Plastic popcorn sculptures were not food, but they definitely looked like it at a glance. These were wall hangings made of melted, textured plastic pellets, red, green, yellow, or white, molded into shapes like Santa Claus, Easter bunnies, pumpkins, or cartoon turkeys. You hung them in windows, you taped them to doors, you leaned them against shelves where the sun could catch them just right and make the whole thing glow like radioactive candy. Every household had at least one, though some had entire holiday collections. They were cheap, they were cheerful, they were tacky in the best way possible. Some were so old they started to warp in the heat, but that just made the snowman look like he was leaning into the season. They weighed nothing but were impossible to throw away. You saw them in classrooms, doctors' offices, and grandma's kitchens. You knew it was Halloween when the grinning plastic witch appeared in the front window. You knew it was Christmas when Santa showed up with his beard of bumpy white blobs. They were oddly comforting, like a warm, lumpy hug from the past. Nobody really talks about them now, but if you find one in a thrift store, you know exactly what it is. And you smile, because deep down, that weird little melted turkey still makes it feel like Thanksgiving. Back in the 1970s, you were not really expressing yourself unless you were doing it through a weird t-shirt. The weirder, the better. I am with stupid and a big arrow? Iconic. Disco sucks in big block letters? Rebellious. Have a nice day with a terrifying smiley face? Totally normal. These shirts were not just clothes, they were statements. Statements that often made no sense but made people laugh anyway. Some featured cartoon frogs drinking beer. Others had random phrases like "instant human, just add coffee." Nobody questioned it. In fact, the less it made sense, the more people wanted one. Tie-dye? Check. Iron-on graphics? Even better. You could walk into a mall and walk out looking like a walking billboard for nonsense. Parents wore them. Teenagers wore them. Even toddlers wore shirts that said things like "Here comes trouble," as if chaos was hereditary. These shirts let you skip small talk. You just showed up and let your chest do the talking. Whether you were sarcastic, grumpy, overly cheerful, or just deeply confused, there was a shirt that said it for you. And if you were really committed, you matched it with short shorts and tube socks. That was your whole personality right there. You could hear it in the first note. Sunshine Pop was like opening a window in your soul and letting the summer breeze in. It was not just music, it was a feeling. Bright, bouncy, unreasonably optimistic. The harmonies stacked like pancakes, the melodies sparkled like soda fizz, and everything about it made you want to roll down a grassy hill and laugh for no reason. You may not remember every lyric, but you remember how it made you feel. Like anything was possible and everything was going to be okay. Even if you were 10 and the world was just your backyard and your mom's burnt grilled cheese. Bands like The Fifth Dimension and The Association sang in choruses that felt like hugs. Up, Up and Away was not just a song, it was a rocket ship made of brass and harmonies. The funny part is how relentlessly happy it all was. Unapologetically cheerful. Like it knew the world was a mess but chose joy anyway. It might sound cheesy now, maybe even a little naive. But back then it felt like hope. And even if it only lasted 3 minutes, that hope was everything. Giant scrunchies were not just hair ties, they were statements. Big, bold, and often made of velvet or shiny satin, they wrapped around ponytails like fabric donuts. One was never enough. Some girls stacked them. Others coordinated them with earrings, shirts, or shoelaces. You might even wear one on your wrist, just in case your hair needed managing at a moment's notice. They came in every color of the rainbow and every pattern imaginable. Leopard print? Check. Neon green? Of course. Polka dots the size of your thumb? Why not? Scrunchies were soft, gentle on your hair, and perfect for the sky-high ponytails the 1980s demanded. Some had sequins, some had bows. All of them made your hair look like it was ready to host a party. You could spot a scrunchie from across the school cafeteria. It bounced when you walked and made even the messiest bun look intentional. Looking back, they seem oversized and silly, but that was the point. Scrunchies were playful, practical, and loud in the best possible way. And even though they disappeared for a while, anyone who wore one back then knows you never really outgrow the joy of tossing your hair into a cloud of fabric. It is one of those things you barely notice until it slides into action. Pocket doors. Unlike the typical swinging door, pocket doors vanish into the wall when opened, like a magic trick you can walk through. They were the height of clever home design in the mid-20th century, especially in homes that wanted a clean, modern look without bulky doors breaking up the space. You would find them separating dining rooms from kitchens or closing off formal living rooms when company arrived. Over time, though, they became a pain. The tracks jammed, the rollers squeaked, and once one went off its rail, good luck fixing it without tearing open the wall. Slowly, builders turned back to swing doors, and pocket doors became a quirky throwback. But if those walls could talk, they would whisper about family dinners, polite goodbyes, and the satisfaction of sliding a whole room out of sight. Now, speaking of questionable style choices, wait until we step into the softest, strangest room in the house, the bathroom. Shared bedrooms among siblings meant privacy was a myth and bedtime was an adventure. 2, sometimes 3 kids in one room, bunk beds, fold-out couches, mattresses on the floor. You learned to sleep through snoring, giggling, and whispered arguments over who stole the blanket. One lamp lit the room. One drawer held everyone's socks. If you wanted quiet, you closed your eyes and hoped for sleep. But there was love there too. Late-night stories, secret jokes, a flashlight under the covers. You made forts out of sheets and built walls with pillows, pretending they were rooms of your own. You learned to share without thinking, to wait your turn, to keep secrets. Sure, you fought. You drew invisible lines down the mattress. But you also looked out for each other, listened when someone cried, celebrated the nights when no one got in trouble. Those cramped quarters built closeness you never asked for, but maybe needed. And years later, you remembered those rooms not for the lack of space, but for the way they held you together. Shared bedrooms were loud, messy, and full of life. And even now, you sometimes miss what it meant to fall asleep beside someone who knew you by heart. Winter nights were not cozy. They were strategic. If your house only had one heater, and it usually did, it lived in the living room and so did you. Forget bedrooms. Every night became a family campout on the carpet. You dragged blankets, pillows, and every couch cushion you could find and stacked them like survival gear. Someone always got the good corner near the heater. Someone always got stuck by the drafty window. You learned to rotate positions like it was assigned seating at a survival school. The heater clicked on and off, rattling like an old engine. And every time it stopped, you held your breath, hoping it would come back. When it kicked in again, pure relief. You toasted your toes until they were half-cooked, then flipped over to warm the other side. Snoring echoed. Siblings squirmed. Someone's elbow was always in your ribs. But nobody complained, because being cold everywhere else was worse. The dog joined the pile. So did the cat. At some point, it felt more like a weird slumber party than suffering. Today, thermostats are on apps. But back then, if you wanted to be warm, you slept where the heat lived. And sometimes, you never wanted to leave that carpet cave. There was no escaping them. Leisure suits were everywhere, and not just on disco floors. Picture this. A grown man, chest hair gleaming under gold chains, sweating through a double-knit polyester jacket in full sunlight. This was not just fashion. It was a national movement. The jacket matched the pants, and sometimes even the shirt. You were not just going out, you were making a statement. And that statement was, I am incredibly flammable but undeniably groovy. Most came in pastel shades like avocado green, mustard yellow, or burnt orange, making the wearer look like a couch from a dentist's waiting room. But that did not matter. If you owned one, you strutted like Travolta, even if you walked like your Uncle Stan. These suits did not breathe. They trapped heat like a greenhouse, and yet people wore them everywhere, from weddings to Wednesday night bowling. If you were really bold, you paired it with platform shoes and a gold-plated belt buckle big enough to pick up radio signals. The leisure suit was the 1970s in clothing form, loud, synthetic, and deeply committed to the bit. It was a time when fashion said, "Function? Never heard of her." And somehow, we pulled it off. They clacked, they thudded, they echoed across school hallways and suburban sidewalks like someone dropped a toolbox full of maracas. Clogs were not just shoes, they were the sound of the 1970s growing louder with every step. Imported in spirit from the Netherlands but reimagined in American malls, these wooden-soled shoes made fashion louder, literally. Kids wore them, parents wore them, teachers wore them, and then regretted it halfway through the school day. There was no sneaking around in clogs. They announced you like a drumline at a parade. But they were sturdy, comfortable, if you got used to them, and they felt weirdly rebellious. Like your feet were telling the world, yeah, I'm gonna be loud about it. Maybe they were impractical. Maybe they didn't match anything you owned, but they looked good with bell bottoms. And in a decade that was all about expression, clogs didn't whisper. They stomped. The funny part is how seriously we took them, like wearing a chunk of painted wood strapped to your foot was the height of elegance. But back then, it was. And if you grew up in that era, you remember how it felt to hear your own footsteps echo through the mall food court like you were walking across the moon. Beanbag chairs were anti-furniture. They didn't care about structure, design, or lumbar support. They just wanted you to plop down, sink in, and forget your bones existed. They came in colors that didn't match anything. Burnt orange, pea green, electric blue, and textures that felt like cheap dreams. Vinyl usually, sometimes velvet, always squeaky. You didn't sit on a beanbag, you disappeared into it. For kids, they were a throne. For teens, a nest. For adults, a regrettable purchase they kept anyway. They made you feel like you were living in a space-age lounge or the back room of a groovy record store. They weren't just chairs, they were rebellion in blob form. Beanbags made rooms feel like clubs or crash pads. No corners, no edges, just wobbling, sagging piles of synthetic comfort. They were everywhere. Basements, dorms, bedrooms, game rooms. And the moment you fell into one, you stopped caring about anything else. That was the trick. The funny part? They were impossible to get out of gracefully. You didn't stand, you rolled, you crawled, you clawed at the air like you were escaping quicksand. But that was part of the charm. Beanbag chairs didn't try to be elegant, they were honest. Honest about what the 1970s really needed, a place to collapse, decompress, and just vibe out. Stirrup pants were the 1980s attempt to combine fashion with function, and they did neither particularly well. These leggings had a strap that looped under your foot, supposedly to keep them from riding up. In reality, they pulled awkwardly at your ankles, made your feet sweat, and caused socks to bunch in weird places. But we wore them anyway. They came in bright colors, bold patterns, and every synthetic material known to mankind. They were stretchy, shiny, and often paired with oversized sweaters or blazers that made no logical sense. From the knees up, you looked like a school principal. From the knees down, you looked like a gymnast caught mid-warm-up. But stirrup pants had their moment. They were the go-to outfit for school picture day, mall trips, or just feeling like you belonged in a fashion catalog. The loop under the foot made you feel oddly secure, like your pants were holding onto you. Sure, they sagged in weird places. Sure, they made your calves look like sausages. But they were a staple, loved, mocked, and deeply missed. For anyone who wore them, stirrup pants were more than a fashion choice. They were a commitment, a stretch of spandex, and a rite of passage. You have seen them in diners, office buildings, and those oddly retro suburban homes from the mid-20th century, glass block windows. These chunky, square panels were not quite clear and not quite frosted, making them the in-between choice for light and privacy. They were a favorite of architects who wanted homes to feel modern, but still secure. Each glass block was thick, textured, and usually about 8 inches square. When stacked together, they looked like a frozen waterfall, a rippling grid of light. But over time, people started to see them as, well, a little strange. They aged poorly, were hard to clean, and made renovations a nightmare. Still, for a while, they represented a very specific version of the American dream. Sleek lines, geometric patterns, and just a little bit of mystery. You could not see out, but the light still came in. And now, most are gone, replaced with clean panes and open views. But you never forget your first home that had a glass block bathroom. Now let us stay in that same spirit, walls that surprise you, with something that used to slide out of nowhere and separate an entire room like a magician's trick. Furniture from thrift stores or curbside finds gave homes that mismatched charm only necessity could create. A sagging couch from someone else's garage sale. A wobbly coffee table rescued from the sidewalk. Chairs with mismatched legs or beds with slats that creaked under every turn. This was what made a living room feel lived in. There was no delivery truck, just a neighbor with a pickup, or a slow push down the block with a dolly borrowed from Uncle Joe. You sprayed it down, you wiped it twice, and you made it yours. Some pieces were covered in throws to hide the rips. Others leaned against the wall to stay upright. But they had character, stories, a past you never asked about. In kitchens, the table might have a burn mark or a dent from years of use, but it still held dinner. In bedrooms, dressers groaned when you pulled the drawers, but they closed eventually. New furniture was for people with money. For everyone else, you took what you could get, and you were thankful for it. Because when money was tight, having something, anything, to sit on was a win. You did not care how it looked. You cared that it worked. When you asked for ice cream, what you got came in a cardboard brick and had the personality of frozen glue. It said vanilla on the label, but that was more of a suggestion than a flavor. It was stiff, icy, and tasted like a memory of milk. You did not scoop it, you sawed into it with a butter knife and prayed it would soften before dinner ended. There were no chunks, no swirls, just an oddly translucent white that never quite melted. You could tap your spoon on it like a drumstick. One side always had freezer burn that made your tongue numb, but you still fought for the last piece. Sometimes the only topping was a drizzle of leftover chocolate syrup that barely squirted out of the bottle. You needed a chainsaw just to scoop it. By the time it softened, you no longer wanted it, but you ate it anyway. Because it was cold, and it was sweet enough. This was not name brand. It was frozen dessert, and it melted into a strange foam if left out too long. It had no creamy swirl, no chocolate ribbon, no cookie bits, just vague vanilla and freezer burn. And sometimes it came with a plastic knife to serve it. You could cut perfect squares, but not because it was fancy, because it was frozen solid. Still, on a hot summer day, it was the best you had. And when your neighbor brought home actual ice cream, you stared, but you smiled. Because your brick was waiting in the freezer, and it was all yours. Imagine handing kids 2 acrylic marbles the size of golf balls and telling them to smack them together as hard and fast as possible. What could go wrong? A lot, actually. Clackers were the noisiest, most chaotic toys of the early 1970s, and every kid wanted a pair. You'd swing the string and try to get the balls clacking above and below your hand like some kind of rhythmic war drum. Mastering the technique took real skill, but when it went wrong, and oh it did, you had 2 solid plastic spheres hurtling toward your face at light speed. The sound they made was somewhere between a metronome and an airstrike. Teachers hated them, parents dreaded them, but to kids they were cooler than lava lamps. Some even cracked and exploded from the sheer force, sending sharp shards across classrooms. Yes, these were marketed to children. It was loud, it was dangerous, and it was pure 1970s joy. Safety was more of a polite suggestion than a requirement back then. and every kid who owned Clackers wore the bruises like medals of honor. They were banned in many schools and recalled in some states, but not before every child had a chance to swing their way into chaos. It started with a blank mesh canvas, a plastic hook, and a tangle of brightly colored yarn that somehow always ended up in knots. But to a kid, or even a bored adult, in the 1970s, latch hook rugs were more than just crafts. They were a challenge, a hobby, a rainy day savior. And they turned every living room into an art studio, every kid into a pixelated painter of Shaggy masterpieces. Maybe it was a rainbow, a unicorn, a cartoon tiger, or just some wild geometric pattern that looked way better in your head. Either way, the finished product hung on your wall with pride, your very own DIY fiber art. It did not matter that it shed more than the family dog or that the corners curled after a week. You made it. You hooked every tuft. You stabbed that canvas like a warrior with a mission. Looking back, it is funny how latch hook rugs turned an entire generation into tiny weavers with zero idea what they were doing. But there was something almost meditative about it, something calming in the repetition, something weirdly profound in pulling strand after strand through the mesh while the Brady Bunch played in the background. No screens, no phones, just you, your yarn, and a dream. Waterbeds promised the future and delivered waves of regret. On paper, they were perfect, a heated mattress that cradled your body like a floating dream. But in practice, not so much. Every turn sent ripples across the surface. You tried to roll over, and the whole bed sloshed like a bathtub during an earthquake. Getting in without making a tidal wave was a skill. Getting out without sliding to the floor was an Olympic event. They were heavy, hard to move, and leaked at the worst times, usually at 3 in the morning, soaking everything from socks to shag carpet. Still, they were trendy. If someone had a waterbed, it meant they were either incredibly cool or easily convinced by an in-store demo. Some people swore by them. Others swore at them. Pets hated them. Kids loved jumping on them until they learned that waterbeds and sharp objects do not mix. But for a brief, glorious window in the 1980s, having a waterbed meant you had arrived. It was furniture and flex all in one. Looking back, they were impractical, ridiculous, and unforgettable. And somewhere, in a dusty corner of a basement, one is still gently sloshing, waiting for its comeback. Before there were curling wands, flat irons, and hair straighteners with 10 settings, there was one holy grail of home beauty, the built-in hairdryer chair. That is right, just like the ones at the salon. These were dome-shaped dryers, fixed right into vanities or dressing tables, and they were everything. Sit down, flip a switch, and suddenly your head was enveloped in a low hum of warm air. These machines were especially popular in the 1950s and 1960s when hairstyles like the beehive or the bouffant required serious volume and serious time. The dryers were sleek, futuristic, and a little noisy, but they got the job done. Housewives would sit under them while flipping through magazines, sipping coffee, or catching up on the neighborhood gossip. Some units were even foldable, tucking away neatly when not in use. Today, we think of beauty appliances as portable and handheld. But back then, hair care was an event, and the home adapted accordingly. These built-in dryer chairs turned the average bathroom into a personal beauty parlor. Sadly, they went the way of Aquanet and home perms. But speaking of gossip, let us head into the hallway because the next stop is where stories were shared, secrets were spilled, and teenage hearts skipped a beat. Using layaway plans was how your family brought home the things they could not afford all at once. The process was simple but long. You picked something out, paid a little now, and waited. Every week or every paycheck, your parents went back to the store and handed over a few more dollars. The items stayed behind the counter, out of reach, until that last payment clicked everything into place. Maybe it was a winter coat. Maybe it was a bike for Christmas. Sometimes it was furniture or shoes or something that felt big, because it was. You did not get instant gratification. You got slow, hard-earned reward. There was no credit card swipe, no overnight shipping. Just weeks of waiting, hoping, and counting. You learned patience. You learned value. And when that final receipt was signed, it felt like winning something impossible. Other families might have walked out with full bags. Yours walked out with pride. Layaway meant you were not giving up. You were building towards something, one payment at a time. And even now, when you buy something in full, you still feel that echo, the deep understanding that waiting made it sweeter. Kool-Aid was supposed to be sweet, but if you were poor in the 1980s, it tasted like liquid heartbreak. You used the whole packet, sure, but only half the sugar. Maybe less, depending on how payday went. The color looked right, but the flavor? Sour sadness with a hint of grape. You would stare at the jug like it betrayed you. Your mom would stir it with a wooden spoon and say, "It's fine, just drink it cold." Friends with name-brand juice boxes looked at you like you were drinking cleaning fluid. You tried to fix it by adding more sugar, but that made a gritty layer at the bottom. And when it separated in the fridge, you had two choices: syrup at the top or colored water below. You would stir it and taste it and then stir it again, hoping somehow the second sip would be sweeter. It never was, but you drank it anyway, because it was cold and purple and yours. You served it in mismatched cups and filled them to the brim. Sometimes there was so little sugar that it made your lips pucker. It was like drinking regret with ice. But no one complained. You made it last, because Kool-Aid was the cheapest juice around, and if you were really broke, you saved the last half for later like it was vintage wine. Today, people complain if their drinks are not organic or have too much corn syrup. Back then, if it was cold and colorful, it was good enough. They were not just headphones. They were headgear. Giant foam-padded beasts that clamped onto your skull like audio vices. You could not hear anything around you, but that was the point. These headphones were the size of dinner plates and looked like something astronauts wore to talk to Houston. And still, they were a must-have. You would plug them into your stereo or record player, press play on your favorite album, maybe some Zeppelin or the Bee Gees, and disappear into your own fuzzy soundscape. They were heavy. They made your hair flat. After 20 minutes, your ears were sweating, but you looked cool, or at least you felt cool. Walking into a room with those headphones on your head made a statement. I am serious about my music. The cord stretched across the room like a tripwire. Someone always got tangled in it, and if you dropped them, forget it. That was a family heirloom. These things were built like tanks, and you treated them with respect, even if they slowly crushed your skull while playing Stairway to Heaven. Sound quality? Questionable. Style? Unmatched. Pong was the big bang of video games, an origin story wrapped in pixelated silence and digital tension. 2 paddles, 1 square ball. No levels, no story, no characters, just pure, unfiltered challenge. And yet, it consumed us. You could play for hours, trying to outlast your sibling or beat your high score. The beep when you missed was devastating. The sound of the bounce, hypnotic. It was electronic tennis for people who didn't know they needed electronic tennis. Pong made your television do something new, something personal, interactive. You weren't just watching, you were playing, controlling, competing. It felt futuristic, like you were controlling electricity with your thumbs. And when you won, it was not just a game, it was a triumph. And that changed everything. The funny part, it barely did anything, but it did enough. Enough to spark a multi-billion-dollar industry. Enough to prove that simple could be powerful. It turned coffee tables into battlefields and parents into reluctant players. Pong was the first taste. And once you had it, you knew something big had started. VHS rental adventures were more than just picking a movie. They were the night's main event. You walked into the store greeted by rows of clamshell cases, each one shouting for your attention with over-the-top artwork and dramatic taglines. New releases lined the front wall, but they were often already rented, marked by empty plastic holders and your own growing disappointment. So you wandered. Comedy? Horror? Something animated for your little brother? You judged movies by their cover. You flipped tapes to read the backs, squinted at blurry screenshots, and made last-minute switches at checkout. there was pressure. Choose wisely. You had this movie for 2 nights, maybe 3. Forget to rewind? Expect a fee. Some stores even had a "Be Kind Rewind" sign that became a national motto. You got home, made popcorn, and watched together as a family. The sound of the tape sliding into the VCR meant it was officially movie night. VHS rentals turned average evenings into little adventures. They made choosing a movie feel like a quest. And even though we stream everything now, nothing beats the charm of browsing those old shelves and hoping your top pick had not been snatched first. If any of these fads made you laugh, cringe, or suddenly remember your glow-in-the-dark shoelaces, drop your favorite in the comments, give us a thumbs up like you're hitting a jukebox, and subscribe so you do not miss the next nostalgic trip down memory lane.